Yeah, you pretty. You ready to talk?
Never let life hold you down. You always kept it moving. The better life you were pursuing. Mississippi to Chicago, just to be a maid cleaning homes. What you had to do, no. Hello, my name is Kyla Williams Tate, and I am the host of the Digital Determinants Podcast. But first, a story. In 1929, my grandmother, Clara Louise Woodley, was born in Carroll County, Mississippi, in an unincorporated area named Kyla. Kyla was a former Choctaw Native American town on a creek of the same name and translates to Panther Comes There. In the Choctaw Nation, the panther is a symbol of strength, courage, and protection. And if you do my grandmother, all three words describe her perfectly. According to the census records in 1930, my 1-year-old grandmother lived with her parents, my great-grandparents, her 2 brothers, ages 6 and 4, and her only sister, age 2. Her father's brother also lived there. By the 1940 census, my grandmother, now 11 years old, and her family had moved to a neighboring unincorporated area named Black Hawk, and 4 additional brothers had been added to that siblingship. They were a big family. Now, by the time the 1950 census rolled around, my grandmother's story and life had changed significantly. She was soon to be 21, was married herself, and lived on Gravel Road, L.W. Wade Place in Itta, Mississippi. I have no idea where that is, but I'm going to be using the maps to kind of figure out where that is exactly today. And Itta is located in Leflore County, so a neighboring county of Carroll County, and is known for being the place where the brutal murder of Emmett Till occurred. Itta is also the home to Mississippi Valley State University, where I received my master's in business administration in 2022. I'm so anxious and curious about the census records for the 1960s and the 1970s, because I think that's just going to add even more layers on to this story, and I'm excited for those to be released. I don't know why we have to wait so long for the census records to be released. Like, I need this information now. Now, like thousands of Black folk, my grandmother participated in the Great Migration. She migrated north to Chicago in approximately 1953. We're not exactly sure, but we think 1953 is a good approximation. I'm not sure why she chose Chicago specifically. I don't know if there are other family members who are here already, or that there was some previous connection to Chicago. But I do know that the rumor mill had it that my grandfather had a conflict with the Ku Klux Klan and had went into hiding. And that my grandmother, in search of a safer place for her children, for herself, potentially for her husband, wanted to leave Mississippi and made the decision to come to Chicago. But she didn't have the means to do that all at once, if you will. So she made a decision to leave her 4 children. So remember, in 1950, she had 3 children. By 1953, she had 4 children. She decided to leave those 4 children with her mother and move to Chicago in search of a better life for them. She was going to get a job and save money and acquire a place to stay, and then at some given point, go back and get her children and bring them to the Chicagoland area. So first, I can't even imagine the strength and resilience it took to make the decision to leave her children in Mississippi and come to Chicago, and what she had to endure as a woman during that time, doing this all by herself. Now that I'm 50 myself, I wish I had been more present of mind to ask her about these stories while she was still here. We never really talked about her time in Mississippi, her transition to the Chicagoland area. We knew that it was hard because there's a lot of hard stories in many folks' backgrounds, right? And I think that we wanted to really just concentrate on the joy. So we never really talked about her time in Mississippi. We just talked about the time current and what we were doing with each other in present time. But I do wish I had have had the mindset to sit down and ask her the questions. I'm such a history buff, so it was a missed opportunity, yeah. And a stolen opportunity, depending on who you ask, because a lot of our history is being changed right before our eyes, even though we were living it and can, give a first-hand account to it. But that's another episode for another day. At the turn of the 20th century, most Black Americans lived in the southern states. But from 1960 to about 1970, during the Great Migration, it is estimated that some 7 million Southerners relocated to urban areas in the North and in the West. Chicago attracted slightly more than 500,000 of those approximately 7 million African Americans who left the South during those decades. Clint Smith, author of How the Word is Passed, brilliantly, and I mean brilliantly, presented a crash course on the Great Migration. That is a pivotal piece in why I decided to walk this research journey in the first place that led to my Benton Opportunity Fund Fellowship application. Now I'm busy, y'all, because digital equity in Cook County, big project, lots of things going on. Got my family, got my friends, taking care of my mom. I got a lot of things going on. But there was something about the Great Migration and learning more about it that really just kicked up some curiosity in my spirit. So listen to Clint Smith talk more about the Great Migration.
Hi, I'm Clint Smith, and this is Crash Course Black American History. And today, we're talking about the Great Migration. Sometimes moving is exciting. Maybe an exciting job opportunity pulls you to a brand new city, and so you get to move someplace you've never been. Or you go from being a college student to a working adult and get to move into the apartment of your dreams. Or, if you were like me, one that you shared with 7 other people. Shout out to your early 20s. But sometimes people don't leave a place simply because they want to, but because, in one way or another, they've been pushed away. In what would become known as the Great Migration, which took place in the early to mid-20th century, many Black Americans who lived in the South moved to the northern United States, to the urban South, and to the West. They did this to find better jobs, more economic mobility, and to escape the ever-present threat of violence in the South. Let's start the show. I want to note up top that this episode will address some challenging topics like extreme violence. During the Great Migration, large numbers of Black Americans left the Jim Crow South in 2 waves. One, from around 1910 through 1940, and another from 1940 to 1970. It was one of the largest domestic migrations in American history. You see, in 1910, Most Black Americans lived in the South, 90% in fact. And this makes a lot of sense because most of slavery had been centered in the South. And even after the emancipation of enslaved Black Americans, many folks stayed in the same areas where they had previously lived. But by 1940, around 1.5 million Black Americans had left their homes, and that percentage of Black Americans in the South had dropped to 77%. And by 1970, that number would drop to 52%. They mostly went to cities like Chicago, Illinois, Detroit, Michigan, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and New York City. In my own family, we had a lot of people leave New Orleans and actually move out to the West Coast, settling in and around Los Angeles. In the early 1900s, Black Americans were being both pushed out of the South and also pulled toward the North. As for why they were pushed away from the South, after slavery, many Black Americans were subjected to a physically taxing and economically precarious system called sharecropping. To learn more about how unfair this system was, let's go to the thought bubble. So let's say there's a farmer. We'll call him Farmer Joe. Maybe Farmer Joe or his dad or granddad before him had a plantation where he had enslaved workers who tended to the land. After the war was over, because of the 13th Amendment, Farmer Joe can no longer enslave those workers, so he had to find a different arrangement in order to plant and harvest the crops on that land. This arrangement was known as sharecropping. The way it worked was like this. Farmer Joe brought in some help. They might be formerly enslaved people, or the descendants of formerly enslaved people, or poor whites. He provided these workers with land, cabins, seeds, animals, and the tools needed to work on the farm from the beginning of the season through the harvest time. All of these things were provided to the workers on credit. By the end of the harvest season, Farmer Joe had a certain expectation about how many crops he would receive. And if that expectation wasn't met, he could claim that the workers were now even further indebted to him than they were before. And because of high interest rates, unpredictable harvest seasons, and deceptive agreements by the landowners, many sharecroppers found themselves in a cycle of endless debt that was difficult, if not impossible, to escape. There were even laws in place that prevented sharecroppers from leaving the land if they were in debt to the landowner. And Farmer Joe could even send his workers to jail for these debts. All of this would go on to shape the racialized prison industrial complex. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Even when Black Americans owned their land, factors like unpredictable weather and pests like the boll weevil made farming less and less sustainable and also less profitable. Because so many Black Americans in the South were earning next to nothing because of this cyclical debt, the idea of finding more stable work in the North became increasingly appealing. Stories from those who had made their way to these other cities trickled back down south. Jobs in the North, the story went, created by the auto industry, meatpacking industry, and steel and iron industry, were paying Black people a lot more money. Black men that were only earning 75 cents a day while working in the South could make up to $5 a day working in the North. And for many, it seemed too good to pass up. Another huge reason for the Great Migration was the impact of Jim Crow and domestic terrorism by groups like the Ku Klux Klan. Even though the Reconstruction Amendments promised Black Americans freedom from slavery, the right to vote, for men at least, and full citizenship with all the benefits it was supposed to carry, many white Americans just weren't okay with that. They showed their displeasure with both institutional and interpersonal violence, filling the lives of Black Southerners with misery and terror. To start, the Southern United States used Jim Crow laws to segregate Black communities and prevent them from having access to any of the resources that would make their homes, neighborhoods, and communities better. As a result, many Black communities were dilapidated and generally just in poor, terrible condition. What's more, as we've talked about before, Black people couldn't even use the same water fountains, hospitals, waiting rooms, and even cemeteries as white people. I mean, you would think that racism would at least rest with the dead, but it followed you even after you were buried. Many of these southern states used literacy tests, poll taxes, and property requirements to make sure that Black Americans couldn't vote, eroding the power of the 14th and 15th Amendment. And they took it to the extreme by violently destroying Black communities. Think the Wilmington, North Carolina riots of 1898 and the Atlanta riots of 1906. There were groups whose main goal was to maintain white supremacy and black subordination in the South, who used to beat, harass, and lynch black people with unsettling frequency. Other white people who were not necessarily affiliated with these groups also both watched and participated in these violent acts. In fact, many people used to attend lynchings as family events. This violence prompted black people to literally run for their lives to the North and the West. Some have argued that because of this, we should actually think of the Great Migration as a sort of refugee crisis. In her award-winning book, The Warmth of Other Suns, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Isabel Wilkerson writes, "They traveled deep into far-flung regions of their own country, and in some cases clear across the continent. Thus, the Great Migration had more in common with the vast movements of refugees from famine, war, and genocide in other parts of the world, where oppressed people, whether fleeing 21st century Darfur or 19th century Ireland, go great distances, journey across rivers, deserts, and oceans, or as far as it takes to reach safety, with the hope that life will be better wherever they land." Newspapers like the Chicago Defender and other informal networks like church groups, benevolent societies, and black Pullman porters told the stories of many black Americans who were thriving in the North. And that encouraged many black Southerners to take the risk and come join them. But once they arrived there, things weren't just magically better. Oftentimes, things remained really tough. Poverty was widespread, and segregation was still in place. Racism, while it may have looked different in these urban cities, wasn't just limited to the South. So black folks established benevolent societies through churches and other organizations to help new migrants and their families adjust to life in the North. Another fascinating part of the story of the Great Migration is that many white people in the South, as more and more black people began to leave, actually got nervous and were worried that too many black people were leaving. See, as terribly as black people were treated on a social and political level, the economic infrastructure of the South relied heavily on black people's labor. Some employers increased their wages to stem the tide, but most of the time, that wasn't enough. White Southerners got so desperate that they tried to pressure newspapers into telling more negative stories about black life in the North. They would block trains and buses filled with migrants from leaving the South, and even beat and intimidated people for attempting to leave. I mean, think about it. You were beaten if you stayed, and you were beaten if you tried to leave. That was black life in a nutshell. Something to remember is that no matter what, it is never easy to leave home. Though much of the land black people lived on in the early 20th century carried a lot of pain, it also carried a lot of memories. It was part of their lineage. It was part of their history. Leaving home isn't easy, but that also shows you how desperate people were for both economic opportunity and for safety. And while it wasn't perfect for many, the North and the West did provide that. People were able to get economic opportunities that they otherwise just wouldn't have had. And while, to be sure, violence against black folks did exist in the North, it wasn't nearly as extensive as it was below the Mason-Dixon line. What's more, the Great Migration created huge hubs of black urban spaces and culture. It would go on to give us some of our best artists, musicians, and writers. The Great Migration was nuanced, complicated, and dynamic. And the story we tell about it should reflect that complexity. It's not just a story of what was done to black people, but serves as an example of black Americans taking control of their lives, identities, and destinies in a country that was constantly attempting to strip all of those things away from them. The writer Isabel Wilkerson puts it best. Over the decades, perhaps the wrong questions have been asked about the Great Migration. Perhaps it is not a question of whether the migrants brought good or ill to the cities they fled to, or were pushed or pulled to their destinations, but a question of how they summoned the courage to leave in the first place, or how they found the will to press beyond the forces against them and the faith in a country that had rejected them for so long. By their actions, they did not dream the American dream. They willed it into being by a definition of their own choosing. They did not ask to be accepted, but declared themselves the Americans that perhaps few others recognized, but that they had always been deep within their hearts. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.
Now, in the crash course, Clint Smith referenced the Chicago Defender's role in attracting Southerners to the North. And it made me wonder, did my own grandmother hear about the opportunities in Chicago from the Chicago Defender? Or did someone in her network of folks, her family, were they the deliverers of the message around opportunity that existed in Chicago? And did she trust that it would be good for herself and for her children? I'm so fascinated to understand what was happening in her head and in her heart when she made the decision to come to Chicago. So my curiosity just got the best of me, and I started doing a deep internet scan about the Chicago Defender newspaper and the Great Migration. It was both overwhelming and super fascinating. My initial research produced a lot of maps about like the migrant trails and the significance of where people ended up based on where they lived in the South. I found so much information, and I love maps and globes. Like, that is my thing. I love seeing how people can get from one place to another, what methods of transportation they can utilize, and what this piece of the United States or a continent looks like in comparison to others. Love maps, especially old maps and globes. But it made me have an immediate reaction and correlation thought of sorts, because all the places that the Southerners migrated to are currently some of the same places with the deepest connectivity gaps and lowest digital adoption and participation rates. Now, certainly, that is not coincidental, as these places, unfortunately, many of them have high risk factors and low economic opportunity factors. Communities in Chicago and Detroit, Cleveland, Philadelphia, New York City, and Los Angeles have deep documented histories of discriminatory systems, practices, and systemic disinvestment. And if I could make just an early research assumption, many of the people who live in these places probably also have a lack of trust in government, lack of trust in systems, lack of trust in people, lack of trust in each other. Both the lack of trust and discrimination are determinants to digital adoption and participation. Further, I asked myself, how does these determinants and other determinants manifest themselves in descendants of the Great Migration? I'm a descendant of the Great Migration. My brothers, my cousins, their children. How has that impacted our ability to participate fully in digital society? Is there some roots or some lessons, some stories that can lend itself for us to understand that a bit deeper and potentially make some recommendations or identify other opportunities of how we in those places and spaces can increase digital adoption and digital participation? So now I'm in deep, y'all. Like, I have all these research questions swirling through my head, all these thoughts swirling through my head. And then I remember that Benton offered a fellowship opportunity for research in this kind of space for digital equity or broadband connectivity. But I didn't remember the deadline. I knew that the opportunity was out there floating because I had saw the advertisement for it on LinkedIn. But because I was busy doing many things, we were just coming out of our outreach and engagement in the summer months in Cook County and analyzing that data so that we could be prepared to write our plan, which was going to be released in a couple of months. And I was just very distracted. So I didn't really know when the application was due. But then I went back to the LinkedIn post and discovered that the application was due on August 31st, 2023. So on August 31st, 2023, I submitted my application with the research question, what is the relationship between trust, digital adoption, and digital discrimination among descendants of the Great Migration in Cook County? And thankfully, I'm so thankful to Benton for the opportunity. Thankfully, I was selected to participate as one of the 5 fellowship teams in the Equitable Broadband in Urban America Research Group, which is a multi-city, multi-method project that will offer actionable insights into how broadband in urban America can be improved and how state and federal policymakers, local governments, and digital equity champions can continue to build digital equity in these communities. Now, although my research project is focused in Cook County, I plan to heavily include information from other Great Migration recipient cities as an opportunity to help increase awareness and make recommendations using this new lens of research. I will be using a mixed methodology approach centered on storytelling. And y'all know I like a good story. Sis likes a good story. This inclusive approach that I'm using will comprehensively help us to better understand the interplay between history, technology, and marginalized communities. One of my deliverables as part of my fellowship project was creating this podcast, the Digital Determinants Podcast. And here we are. We made it, y'all. Episode 1. I'm going to give myself a round of applause because it's been rough. But this podcast will feature stories and do some data analysis. We're going to do some GIS mapping and have some interviews and many, many more things we're going to talk about on this podcast. So I hope that you join me on this journey every 1st and 15th of the month, tying it to pay cycles here so that we can pay attention. So every 1st and 15th of the month, we will be releasing a new episode of the Digital Determinants Podcast. So I hope that you join me on the journey. Please, will you? Will you join me on this journey? Again, I am Kyla Williams Tate, the host of the Digital Determinants Podcast. Until next time, stay connected.